Right. Today, we are going to learn about how to write the chapter one, which is the introduction of the dissertation. Now what are we doing here? We are in the process of writing our dissertation report, right? So in this case, our dissertation it consists of 5 or 6 chapters, depending on whether it's a quantitative or a qualitative study. So this is mainly focusing on qualitative studies, and your dissertation consists of chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? So your chapter 1 is actually the introduction to the study. So in this video, we are going to talk about how to write the chapter 1. So I would first explain you what are the things that you have to include in chapter 1. So basically, every chapter has to have a chapter introduction, which consists of 5 to 6 sentences, roughly 100 to 150 words about what the chapter is all about. So you have to write this in future tense and say what it will bring to the reader, right? So basically, that's what the chapter introduction is. And then you have to write the background of the study, right? So under the background of the study, you have to give an introduction and a background to the topic, and that flows to your problem statement, right? So now if it depends on your topic, right? It depends on your topic. You can start from the international context and then gradually flow to the local context. So let's say if you're doing a study that is specifically focused on the Sri Lankan context, then you can start off by saying, what's the scenario in the international context? And you can give justifications and citations into it, and then gradually flow to the local scenario, and then you can flow into your problem. And then the next is the problem statement, which is actually your gap, which is what you're trying to fulfill by undertaking this study. So we know the starting point of the research is to first to have a problem or a gap identified, right? Theoretically and practically. So in the problem statement, which is also roughly around, it depends, right? It could be one paragraph of 200 to 400 words with citations, with justifications. So one of the few mistakes that students do when writing the problem statement is that they use terms like there is no research or poor research or limited research. You cannot say that there are no research that has been conducted, because as human beings, we are not exposed to all the literature, right? So there is a possibility that someone somewhere out of the world who has done something similar to your study. So in that case, you should never use the term no research, right? And to find a problem normally, or to find justifications to write your problem, you can take an article and read the future research directions and their findings and see what they have not been able to find, so that you can incorporate it to your study and justify, okay, according to this study, there is a direction that these researchers have guided, that in this area research could be done, so that you can get it as a reference and justify your problem, right? So theoretically and also practically and empirically, you can justify your problem. And please include necessary citations to justify your problem when you're writing your problem statement. And then it is the research questions and objectives. So I forgot to move the slide. So in the background of the study, like I said, you have to give an introduction to your research topic, right? So if I show you an example of a study that I myself did. So this is the topic of my study: spirituality, universal love, and mindful consumption, an examination of consumption practices in of the Sri Lankan consumer activists. So this is actually the total dissertation. So you have to focus on writing the chapter 1. So you can see in the chapter 1, you need to have a chapter introduction. Like I said, it's all about what the chapter consists of. And then you have to write the background of the study, which is, you can give, like I said, you can give a basic introduction to your study and speak a little bit about the background to your topic, right? So in this example, you can see my study was about mindful consumption and how spirituality and universal love influence mindful consumption. So here I have started with the major problem, which is overconsumption, right? Which is in the global context. It's a challenge that we all face, right? So starting from a broader point, you have to gradually narrow down your flow in the introduction or the background, and then flow to your problem statement, right? Like this. So here in the background, I have talked about overconsumption and a little bit of the importance of sustainable practices and mindful practices, and then how mindful consumption can be used as a solution to overcome overconsumption or unsustainable consumption practices with the incorporation of spiritual maturity of a person and with the spread of universal love, right? So that is actually the flow of the background of the study. So you can see with the background, I have gradually come to my problem statement. And these are the citations, right? Like I said, you have to have justifications for your problem statement and follow the reference that has been taught to you all from your university, right? So if I talk a little bit more of the background of the study, you have to explain the context of your study, whether it's in the Sri Lankan context, what happens in the international context, and if you're focusing on a specific industry, you have to talk about that industry as well. So in my study, I have not focused on a particular industry, but if you're focusing on a specific industry, you have to include that as well. And then like I said, then you can gradually flow into your research problem, right? So let me move on to the slides again. And then it is the problem statement, right? So you have to clearly describe your problem or the issue that you are planning to investigate in this research study, right? So it could be either a theoretical gap or a real world problem or a gap that you have identified. So whatever it is, you have to provide justifications. You can't be like saying, I think that there is a gap in this area, so that we have to investigate it. No, you have to come up with articles and literature that says that there is a theoretical gap, right? And then you have to, like I said, you have to give evidences and examples, maybe from the practical world or theories, or like I said, read the future research directions of other researchers and give your justifications accordingly. So if I move to my study again, see, now I have said that how spiritual humans can be used to solve the problem of overconsumption. And you can come up with different literature that speaks this about such connection, and then also you can say how it is a gap because So you can actually mention that there are limited studies that has been conducted in specific areas, but have justifications, right? So please follow this. And next is the purpose of the study. So having identified your problem, you can then start writing the purpose. So since you have a problem, you have an intention to do a particular investigation. So that is your purpose of the study. So in this study, what is the purpose is actually to explore how spirituality and universal love can be used to avoid overconsumption with instilling mindful consumption, right? So that is the purpose of your study. So again, you can write like 100 to 150 words for your purpose of the study as well. And then is the most important, which is your research questions and objectives, right? So your research questions are actually it's basically a problem that is subdivided into several parts where you can collect data and find the findings in order to solve the identified problem gap, right? So your research objectives and questions go hand in hand. You can have 2 to 4 research objectives that will help you in achieving your purpose of the study and your problem. So since this is mainly focused on qualitative studies, you have to use the terms to explore or to understand, right? Um, and if it's a quantitative, you can say to evaluate or to examine the relationship between two variables. But in qualitative studies, we don't do that. So we normally use the terms to explore or to understand, right? So sometimes your research objectives can be similar to your research questions, but sometimes it might not be. Like, let's say, for an example, one of the objectives is to provide recommendations for the policymakers. So you need not to have a research question that says what are the recommendations that we can give for policymakers, right? So that is it. And these questions must be objective and answerable. And it is actually the guide or the foundation of your study, because based on your research questions, you will have to prepare your interview guide or the questions that you're going to ask from your participants, and also your findings chapter, and even your discussion, your implications will be also based on the answers that you get for your research questions, which is why the research questions are very important, right? So if I show you an example of research questions. So in this study, now I clearly told you the purpose was actually to understand how the unsustainable consumption practices can be mitigated by instilling mindful consumption that is supported by universal love and spirituality. So that is the purpose. And this purpose has been subdivided into several sub questions like these. So first of all, I'm trying to understand how consumer activists are perceiving overconsumption, right? And then what are the different mindful consumption practices that these consumer activists have adopted, right? So I couldn't mention, my study was about consumer activists, right? How consumer activists used mindful consumption practices with their spiritual and mindful maturity, right? So that is why we have come up with this question. And then finally, how are universal love and spirituality reflected the consumption practices of these consumer activists? So you can see now these questions are similar to my research objectives as well. So that can happen in some occasions. But sometimes you can also have like another objective, as in to say, to give recommendations to policymakers or to some organization that you have used, right? So that is about the research objectives. And then the next component is the significance of the study, right? So in this section, you have to clearly say why conducting your study matters, right? You can say theoretically what are the significances. You can say that it will introduce a new theory, or it will contribute to the existing theory by fulfilling the identified theoretical gap, or practically what are the significances. It could help the policymakers, the society, the consumers, or the corporate sector, likewise. And so all these things must be included under your significance of the study. So since this is the starting point, again, significances must be written in the significant, right? Because you haven't yet found out the findings, because these findings can be different, right? Even though you have certain expectations in the beginning. So finally, you need to have the definitions of key terms as well. Like, so in this study, in my example, the key terms were spirituality, mindful consumption, and universal love and all. So you can see these. This is how I have written the significances of the study. You can subdivide it into theoretical, practical, empirical, and methodological as well. And normally in chapter 1, we write a brief methodology in the future tense, stating how you are going to undertake this study briefly, and then you can have the definitions of keywords. So the keywords, you have to identify what are the keywords that are in your particular study. So in this study, it's all about mindful consumption, spirituality, universal love, and consumer activists, right? And then another thing is that you can have a study outline, which is where you give brief explanations as to what your chapter 2, 3, and 4, 5 consist of, right? So again, which has to be written in the future tense. So likewise, you can just write simply 4 to 5 sentences what the literature review chapter is all about and will be all about, and what the methodology chapter will explain to you. And since this is a qualitative study, we normally write chapter 4 by including both findings and the discussion together. So that is why it has only 5 chapters. And then the chapter 5 is about your conclusion, right? Where you have to have your future research direction, implications, limitations, and all those things. And then finally, like I said, this has to be chapter summary, which is written in the past tense, because now you have to discuss what the chapter 1 was all about, right? So it could be again 100 to 150 words. And so when you're writing the chapter summary, always have a one sentence at the end to connect chapter 1 to the next chapter, which is your literature review. So that has to be done in every chapter summary, in every chapter, right? So that is about how to write your chapter 1. And I hope it was helpful.